Hey, good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone. So today we start the first of 2 weeks on issues of gender and feminism in the sciences. What I want to do today is, well, first we'll go over all the stuff for the final essay. I have that up on here. So we'll go over that, and today then I want to do a brief sort of introduction to the topic. Both sort of central claims regarding feminism in the sciences, as well as um, investigations as to why this is important for the sciences, right? Why is this necessary for the sciences? Why is this something that's going to be important to science itself? And generally, these fall along two sort of lines. One is that it's necessary or it's important for women in the sciences, that certain gendered stereotypes regarding women's ability to succeed in scientific fields of study, uh, certain gender stereotypes that are assumed to be, reasonable or natural, um, affect the perception of women in the sciences, right? And this is harmful for women who want to go into scientific fields, and this is important. Um, Also, these types of gender stereotypes are harmful to science itself, right? So that we bring our own sort of gendered baggage to the sciences means that we're not viewing things objectively. And this can be harmful for scientific research, for scientific claims. What we'll do today and then again next week is focus on a very specific example in primatology, right? So the study of non-human apes. And I want to highlight a few sort of, assumptions that we carry with us that really for a good period of the history of primatology affected both how we think about non-human primates and also how we think about ourselves and our own behaviors and what counts as and is viewed as natural or natural order of things for us. So this week today's sort of an overview of the problem, why it matters, who it matters for, and then some general terminology like standpoint epistemology that's going to become more important next week. And then for Wednesday's lecture, then we'll look at the essay by Evelyn Fox Keller, a sort of more traditional voice for feminism in the sciences, writing in the 1980s. And we'll go over that then before we look at a few more radical claims from Sandra Harding and Sandra Blackford Hardy for next week. So before we get into all of that, then final essay. So the final essay is due Wednesday, May 6th by the end of the day. So you have till 11:59 p.m. Now this does give you a few weeks to work on this. So yeah, if this would have been if we were in class something that's a bit different, uploading to Blackboard. We've all been doing this now for the response paper, so there shouldn't be anything new. In the assignments folder on the contents tab, you have an assignment listed as final essay. So upload that there. You can find the handout there. You can also find the handout in the course documents folder of the content tab, along with the syllabus and the midterm essay handout where you found that. It's also there as well. Yeah, so if you take a look at that, not much has changed from the midterm essay to the final essay. Um, it's still the same rubric applies. It's still out of possible 40 points. So, everything I said about the introduction and the conclusion for the midterm essay, comments that I made on your midterm essays regarding the introduction and the conclusion, those count for the final essay as well. So the same things apply there. So again, if you had comments to the effect that I was looking for a bit more from your intro or your conclusion, do take those to heart for the final essay. Yeah, the 20 points for the body of the essay is the same. You'll see on the final essay handout there are the three prompts you can pick from there. And pick one of the three there. That's totally up to you. There's one on Popper and Kuhn. There's one on Kuhn and his successors like Loudon and Lakatos. And then there's one on these issues of gender in the sciences. So yeah, pick one of those three for that. And then yeah, so changes are obviously it's going to be a bit longer. I think it was 5 to 7 pages for the midterm essay. This is going to be 6 to 8 for the final essay. And again, that is 6 to 8 full double-spaced pages, 12-point font, standard margins, all of that. Don't count your title page. Don't count your works cited page. Yeah, 6 full pages of text is what I'm looking for at a minimum here. So yeah, that's really the only change other than using an outside source. So I'm going to require you to use one outside source that I say makes a significant contribution to your essay. Um, so again, don't just give me, I don't know, the birth dates of Thomas Kuhn and cite that from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Thomas Kuhn, right? Or don't just give me a definition of feminism from the Internet Encyclopedia or something like that, right? I'm looking for a an essay about your topic, right? So something I would say, if you look at the um, footnotes and endnotes from the essays that you're going to be working with. So whether that is Godfrey Smith's text, whether that is Kuhn's work and structure, whether that is these essays on feminism and the sciences, those are pretty good places to look. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I already gave you that information. That's another good place to look for sources. If you're having trouble finding an outside source, do start looking for that early. You have a significant amount of time here to work on this. I can be of help if you're looking for a source, if you're having trouble finding it. Or if you found a source, if you want to shoot it to me in an email, hey, is this a good source? Make sure if you do that, though, you're explaining how you're going to use it and in what ways you're going to use it, right? Those really are the only two differences. So again, yeah, the final 10 points in the rubric are for grammar, spelling, punctuation, and citation. Really make sure you're doing citations for the final essay. A lot of students lost points on this for the midterm essay. You need to cite direct quotes, both from your outside source and from our readings in class. So your works cited page should have the relevant course readings from our syllabus that you're using for your essays, as well as your outside source. In the text, you need to use in-text citations. How that works for your specific citation style, depends on the citation style. If it's parenthetical citations, if it's footnotes, you need something in text that tells me where you're getting these quotes from. Likewise, even if you're not using direct quotes, if you're merely summarizing someone else's view, you need a citation as to where you're getting that from. You might describe crisis for Thomas Kuhn, if you're writing on that, as this point where anomalies become such that we lose faith in our paradigm and these types of things. Even if you're just summarizing Kuhn, you need a citation there saying where you're getting that from. A page number from Kuhn's work needs to be included there, or from Godfrey Smith, depending on where you're getting it from. But make sure you're doing those citations, right? So yeah, so the only real difference is it's a little bit longer. You need to use an outside source, but everything that I've said about your midterm essay, if you lost points for something like citations or your intro and conclusion, these apply equally as much, well, more so because it's weighted more heavily for the final essay. So yeah, I'm again available to read drafts of these. I'm gonna put a draft deadline on Friday, May 1st by the end of the day. So shoot me an email. If you want to discuss anything over Zoom, we can certainly do that. Yeah, if you send me either a Word doc or a PDF, I'm happy to look it over and send thoughts back to you, provided it's in by the end of the day on Friday the 1st. Um, yeah, and same thing applied from the midterm essay. I'm happy to read over whatever you have done by the 1st of May. So if it's a full draft, that's great, but don't feel like if you don't have a full draft done, you can't send anything in. I'm happy to read a partial draft, an outline, even just an introduction. If you did have lose points on your midterm essay for the introduction, if you just want to send me your intro and say, hey, is this more what you're looking for? I'm happy to read that over as well. Yeah, like I said with the midterm essay, Word doc or a PDF is fine to email to me. I can be more helpful in a Word document than a PDF. If need be, I can go in and track changes and make comments and all of that. With a PDF, I can really just give you sort of general comments. So, yeah, so draft deadline by Friday, May 1st. So I'm going to try something a bit different. Our last class, if you look at the syllabus, is TBA. I typically use that, especially in the spring, for if we have snow days or stuff like that. Obviously, we're not in class, we don't really have any snow days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a optional synchronous Zoom meeting. So I'll send everyone an email invitation to the Zoom meeting. I'll be here live during our class time for any questions that you would have over anything relating to the final essay, anything that's unclear from any of our lectures or any of the PowerPoints or anything like that. I'm happy to discuss that with you. And yeah, if you'd like something more one-on-one, feel free to shoot me an email and we can meet one-on-one at a different time. But I'll just be here, at this Zoom meeting during our class time for anyone who wants to log in and ask any questions. Yeah, maybe I'll show you my cats if they're around. So anyway, Yeah, again, the final essay should be pretty straightforward. You all did the midterm essay. Like I said, it's you know pretty similar to that, aside from a bit longer in the outside source. Everything I said about drafts, everything I said about the rubric, all of that applies to the final essay in the same way that it did for the midterm. So yeah, if you have any questions on this, take a look at the handout in the course documents folder, and then if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or set up some time to meet via Zoom. Okay, so feminism in the sciences. Yeah, so Godfrey Smith talks about like in the post-Kuhn era, when we're looking more at the sociology of sciences, there seems to be a shift in thinking about the sciences, particularly in the 1970s, the 1980s, up to the 1990s. Um, Historically, science was seen as something of an outsider pursuit, an anti-establishment pursuit. If you look at, with when comparing science to something like religion, right? You had someone like Galileo or Darwin challenging the church's sort of, monopoly on knowledge, right? And drawing the ire of the church, certainly. Yeah, Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for his claims that the Earth wasn't the center of the solar system. We see, the controversy in the late 19th century, early 20th century regarding Darwin's work on evolution and the challenges this poses for the church. So historically, scientists were seen as these outside figures that use sort of the natural world to challenge the dominant thinking about certain things. And we see this in the way that Karl Popper has talked about scientists, this very sort of mythologized idea of the scientific figure. Feyerabend talking about these charismatic sort of, bomb throwers in the sciences that tend to shake things up, right? And this perspective sort of shifts in the 1970s, 1980s. Um, Science becomes, as religion sort of loses its dominant influence, science becomes this sort of structure that, like I say, reinforces the dominant social order. As opposed to being anti-establishment, science becomes firmly part of the establishment that sort of, maintains and reinforces the status quo, decides who we listen to and who we ignore, and that certain voices, ideas, certain people are ignored or marginalized by the science. And we can see this most clearly in the ways that there's a perceived maleness to the scientific world and the scientific work, the way that we marginalize women and women's perspectives in the sciences. So, none of this is unique to the sciences, right? These types of gender stereotypes that we're going to be discussing didn't come from the sciences. They weren't invented by the sciences, but they certainly seep into the sciences throughout the history of the sciences. And they're just starting to be recognized when we have this sociological shift in the sciences, when we start looking at what it means to be objective, when we start looking at what scientists do, when we have this turn away from investigating science, like we did at the beginning of the semester, to an investigation of scientists, right? That we bring our own sort of cultural, historical, societal baggage to bear on our scientific work and our scientific observations. And as Hansen shows us, this history, this standpoint can affect what we view, how we view it, how we make observations, and how we make interpretations, right? So yeah, so none of these gender stereotypes should be um, foreign to any of us. It is a shame that they aren't. But this is certainly not the first time I think that you will have heard this idea that there are these certain stereotypes associated with masculinity and femininity, with the idea of the male and the idea of the female. Right. So historically, these gender stereotypes tell us that men are more reasonable and rational and women are more emotional and irrational, right? None of these are true and none of them really make sense. And you see a lot of like weird things happening with them. But, this is historically the way that women have been marginalized, is by claiming that, aside from men, women are more emotional or irrational to the rational or reasonable male, right? You get these ideas of, the nurturer, the home life from for women as a gender stereotype, with the idea of the provider for men. This gets even more sort of generalized as the male or masculinity is seen as like an active force, where the female or femininity is seen as a passive force. So yeah, so this gets associated with, if the male is this active purveyor of reason and rationality, then science and scientists get associated with men. Um, Whereas if, we have this sort of passive, nurturing, emotional, irrational uh, stereotype of women, women get associated with nature, or Mother Nature, right? Yeah, and in the most general sense, we get this idea that the male is the subject and the female is the object, or rather, the male is the subject of study, the scientist, and the female is the object of study, nature. So, in scientific language, we often have this gendered type of discussion, this gendered language, which is often just like unnecessary, right? Based on these types of stereotypes. So, this idea that nature needs to be regulated or controlled by science, right? This idea of something that is unwieldy or irrational or unregulated or out of control in nature that needs to be sort of, tempered by science. Nature needs to be made rational by science, or that nature sort of yields or gives way or is passive to the active science or scientist or scientific claim. Yeah, so Godfrey Smith has this like really gross section from Francis Bacon where he's talking about the marriage of science and nature, and it should be like a marriage where the female nature is subservient to the scientist male. And you're like, yeah, I mean it's nonsense, but it is historically how women have been viewed throughout history, and this affects the sciences as much as it affects any other sort of realm of human activity. I do a few weeks in my philosophy of art class regarding how women are portrayed in the arts and how women are marginalized in the arts as well as the sciences. That but this claim from the sciences that women don't have what it takes, so to speak, to be good scientists becomes this claim that women don't have what it takes to be good artists in the arts. And here you really see the goalpost moving to try to keep all of these sort of pursuits, directed towards men and to marginalize women in them. In the sciences, we're told that you need reason and rationality and not to be overly emotional to be a good scientist. So women are marginalized from that based on these gender stereotypes. And in the arts, we talk about how this male passion or drive for the arts makes them ideal artists. And you're like, wait, didn't you just say that was the thing that you didn't want? It seems to be sort of like goalpost moving, right? So a lot of it is really just making it up as it goes along. They don't have any basis in reality, but are socially constructed. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, so Godfrey Smith talks about all this and he says, it's problematic, but it's this really weird passage where he's like, I wonder if this has actually done any harm to anyone or if it's merely coincidental. And it certainly does do real harm to women in the sciences and the way women are portrayed and the way women are thought about inside and outside the sciences. We're going to see some pushback with the essay on Thursday for this as well. So, gender stereotypes harmful to science. I mean, it's obviously harmful to women who want to pursue scientific careers or want to excel in scientific fields. We have this long-standing false gender stereotype that women are somehow less suited biologically to the sciences, based on those stereotypes that we had mentioned just a minute ago, right? That there's something irrational or emotional about women that make them less suited to these scientific fields of study. And you still see these coming through. Just a few years ago, the head of the STEM programs I think it might have even been Harvard, made the same claim that women are just less. The reason you see less women in the sciences is that women are less biologically suited. And I mean, it's bullshit. I mean, it's just not true. The reason you see women in the sciences less is because we've told women that they can't succeed in these positions, or we've simply barred them in admittance, or we've looked down on their work because of these gender stereotypes, right? So, not only is it harmful for women who want to pursue scientific careers, but it's also harmful for science as well, for scientific knowledge. And the idea here is that these gender stereotypes affect our scientific claims and our scientific observations in the ways that Hansen described, right? That these become the background, the history that we bring with us when we make observations. And if we have these gender stereotypes outside of the sciences, there's a risk that they bleed into our scientific work as well. So yeah, this is most, I think, well, not maybe not most, but a really good example of this is in the history of primatology. So we're going to look at this in a lot more detail with Sandra Bluffer Hardy's work at the end of next week. But as just a little primer, historically, the story that was being told when you had male scientists sort of going into the jungle to observe the behavior of non-human apes Um, you get this sort of like old, very masculine view or male-centered view of the sexual and social behavior of apes, of gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans. Um, yeah, so these male researchers come back from the jungles, and they write these papers on primate behavior, and they state, well, what we saw when we observed these social groups is that the males often control when mating happens. They control sexual access, it's called. They're the sexually dominant of the species. Mating happens when the male decides that mating happens. The females are passive in these matings and consent to reproduction at the desire of the male. The male decides when and how mating and reproduction occurs. If the primates are what we call pair bonded, meaning that one male and one female bond for a certain period of time. If the apes are pair bonded, the male is the dominant of the pair. The female is submissive to the active male. You see what we're doing here? In the case of harems, where there's one male and many females, the singular male is the dominant ruler of the harem. Right? So this is what you get from these male scientists coming back and saying this is what we have, and it's not true, right? The view that they have is simply incorrect, right? In our closest primate relatives, so chimpanzees, bonobos, but even in orangutans and gorillas, um, it's often the females of the group that control sexual access. So the females decide when and how mating occurs and with which males. It's often the females who are sexually and socially dominant. They decide when and how mating happens. They lead sort of the primate social groups. Yeah, females. What we'll see when we talk about this in Senator Bluffer Hardy's essay is that females have a much more diverse sex life with a variety of partners and sexual practices. We'll discuss this idea of sperm competition. In essence, though, what happens is like females will mate with several males to subtly manipulate males into taking care of young. So the idea is the more males that they mate with, the more males will think that the offspring, might be theirs, so they'll take an active role in raising and protecting that child. So the female apes will sort of trick the males into thinking that that the offspring is theirs. Yeah, a lot of important primate social structures are matriarchal. There's a dominant female rather than a dominant male, right? So none of these things that these original scientists are discussing is true. And they're just like, well, what happened? What changed? Well, what changed is the researchers. In the 1970s, 1960s, 1970s, you have people like Jane Goodall going into the jungles and observing these from a different perspective, from a woman's perspective, and coming back with these views that are wildly different from these gender stereotypical views that male scientists are coming back with. Yeah, so I mean, this idea, I mean, this really goes back to Hansen, right? This bear on a tree. Remember, like before you said what this was, you look at it and you're like, it could be a lot of stuff, right? But once someone says it's a bear on a tree, you can see the paws wrapped around the tree. You can see the sort of vertically arched lines as the trunk of a tree, and it looks completely natural. It seems obvious. Of course, this is a bear on a tree. We forget where that claim came from, where we got that information from. And it was just some arbitrary Hansen saying bear on a tree. He could have easily said something else, right? Um, so yeah, I think someone in my last class said like insects on a blade of grass could be easily as accurate as bear on a tree, right? We forget that we got that position from somewhere. We efface its standpoint or its origin and we treat it as natural. We efface the origins. We forget that it's just someone telling us that. We do the same thing with these gender stereotypes. We take them to be something natural or the natural way of the world, and we forget that they're socially constructed. They are no more real than this drawing is a bear on a tree, right? Someone told us that that's how you should interpret these lines, just like someone says this is how you should interpret interactions between men and women, as this idea of these gendered stereotypes that we went, right? So when we get out into the jungles for these male researchers, it seems obvious what's going to happen, right? So we typically view interactions between males and females. When do we most often view them? Well, not in primates, right? We have to go out into the jungle for weeks or months, maybe, but certainly not for, the rest of our lives. We have much more experience with human behavior where these gendered stereotypes play a larger role. Thankfully, we're seeing that break down to some extent now. But this human behavior in the 1950s, certainly much more than the 21st century, but still, conform to these gender stereotypes. So what happens is we start seeing, we look at what we see in primates under the context of what we're typically used to seeing, or with our own baggage and our own history and our own context to them. And we focus on similarities and ignore the differences, just like we did with this image in the lower right hand corner of both of these pictures. And when it's around other birds, we focus on the similarities to other bird-like figures and ignore the differences. We talked about that class. Likewise, when it's around other things that more resemble antelopes, we focus on the similarities and ignore the differences. So yeah, so we see this outside of gender roles when we just talk about sexual stereotypes in primatology, right? If you had to guess or just state what our closest non-human primate relative is, the orangutan? No, right? Um, for a long period of human history, scientists really thought that the orangutan was our closest primate relative. Why? Right? This is clearly incorrect. What led them to this? And it was honestly like our religious morals affecting scientific research. What we focus on and what we ignore. We focus on certain similarities between our sort of sexual practices and those of orangutans. So orangutans are one of the few animals that pair bond for very long periods of time. Some would say for life, along with gibbons and a few others. So we took monogamy to be like the natural sort of way that humans pair bond, right? Monogamous relationships for life, marriage, so to speak. And we looked out into the animal kingdom and we saw these sexually promiscuous bonobos and chimpanzees, and we said, that's not us. We saw gorillas with a harem with one male with multiple females, and we said, that's not us. And we saw something like an orangutan that has one male to one female pair bonded for long periods of time and said, bingo, that's us. That's what we're going to focus on. And obviously, this isn't true. Our closest relatives are going to be these more sexually promiscuous chimpanzees and bonobos who don't pair bond for really like any length of time. Yeah, we see this too when we talk about how, if you look out into the animal kingdom, if you only focus on certain aspects of it, you get this idea of the sole purpose of sexual activity is reproduction or procreation, right? So this leads to these horribly um, um, detrimental claims that there's something unnatural or against the natural order of things in homosexuality that does real harm to LGBTQ people. And what we find out is like this just isn't true. Right? In our closest primate relatives, sex isn't just used for reproduction or procreation. Both, if you look at chimpanzees and especially bonobos, our closest relatives, sex practices, both hetero and homosexual sex practices, are much more used to gain closeness to others in a social group, to create and reinforce these social bonds, much more than for reproduction. What Sandra Blaffer Hardy will say is that if we want to say that sex is only used for reproduction, what we see when we look at primates, which is females having sexual relationships with males outside of ovulation, makes no sense whatsoever, right? But it happens for other reasons, one of which being to create and reinforce social bonds. Now, there is a very, I think, compelling argument coming out of contemporary queer theory that these types of what we call naturalizing the LGBTQ population is sort of unnecessary. So the idea is like, well, regardless of what you're doing is you're trying to explain my sexuality through something that is explained biologically to justify it as natural. And then if it was not natural, it would be something to be derided or to be marginalized or whatever. And the argument from queer theory is that whether or not homosexuality is biological or my choice, it should still be accepted as valid, right? Just because it is not natural does not make it invalid. So again, there's some pushback in contemporary queer theory about this. But Yeah, all of this comes from like we bring our own baggage here, whether that's gender stereotypes, whether that's sexual stereotypes. Uh, what we see, what we observe is affected by the beliefs that we bring to the table. So what all this means is that like standpoint matters. What's important to take from these examples that we discussed is this, that it took women in primatology to correct these mistakes in the way gender hierarchies and societies work in non-human apes. This is Jane Goodall in the 1970s. It took researchers from diverse backgrounds to properly interpret primate sexual behavior. This is a wonderful book called Sex at Dawn. If anybody's interested in these types of discussions, looking at the biological basis of human sexual preferences in non-human primates, in bonobos and chimpanzees specifically. It's a really great book. It's really readable. It's written by scientists, but for a lay audience. You don't have to have any knowledge of primatology. You'll see with like Sandra Bluffer Hardy's work, some of it gets a bit in the weeds, but with this, it's really readable. It's funny. It's a fantastic read. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, it's really good. If anybody is interested in it, it's excellent. So this gets us into this what we call standpoint theory or standpoint epistemology. That someone's history, background, their own experiences matter when they are making observations. One's perspective affects the knowledge that one acquires. I mean, this is generally Hanson's point, right? Our history, our background, the order in which we see things, what we bring to the table in us affects our ability to make knowledge claims, to make observations, to interpret data. So when we argue that we need more women in the sciences and more representation of women in the sciences, this is more than just an appeal to gender equality. Gender equality is super important, right? Like this should be something that we all strive for is equality among the genders in the sciences, just for general equality standards. But it's also vitally important for the sciences. We need these perspectives. If we only have one standpoint, this sort of dominant white male perspective, we risk misinterpreting things or we risk not seeing the whole picture. We risk ignoring things that are important or focusing on only one aspect of an observation, right? The more perspectives we have, the more sort of broad, the more well-rounded our observations can be. And this is this claim from standpoint theory, that some standpoints carry special weight or importance. Now, there's going to be some pushback from this, and I understand the motivation for that. Um, but really, standpoint theory is claiming that there's something to the perspective of women or people of color or Latinx or queer perspectives that carry special importance that we need in a whole host of fields. But here, what we're talking about is really the sciences, that these have special importance in the sciences. Now, the pushback from this, I think, stems from this idea that, oh, well, you're saying that my claim as a white male man isn't valid or isn't valuable. And that's not true. What they're not claiming is that intrinsically women's perspectives just matter more than men's, or that the perspective of people of color matter more than the perspective of white people, or that queer perspectives matter more than cis or heteronormative perspectives. What they're claiming is that in the context of being an alternative to the dominant view, these perspectives certainly carry special weight. So it's the social position of these standpoints that makes them valuable. In that they are the marginalized or often ignored voices, they carry special importance. We need to focus on them more. So yeah, when everyone sees something the same way, this different perspective can be of value, not because it's intrinsically more valuable, but because in opposition to, or not even opposition to, in comparison to the dominant view, we get these perspectives less. So we want them more. We want that more well-rounded perspective. So yeah, so the question becomes like, well, these gender stereotypes are the world we all live in. Why, why? In other words, if both Jane Goodall and male primatologists grew up with the same gender stereotypes, why is it that Jane Goodall sees things out there that these male researchers don't? And this is gets to this idea of dual vision. This becomes super important for standpoint theory. So dual vision, or it's often called second sight in W.E.B. Du Bois' work on race, um, really starts with, well, Du Bois, but also uh, uh, George Lukács in well, I guess like the early to mid 1900s. So Lukács was a Marxist theorist. So looking at capital, this interaction between the working class and the ruling class, right? Um, And what Lukács claims is that one's knowledge or understanding of the world is inversely related to one's social standing. So, the higher one's social standing is, the less knowledge they have about the world, and the lower one's social standing, the more knowledge they have about the world. And you're like, wait, how does that make sense? Because it seems like, right, the more capital, the more money you have, this ruling class should have more knowledge. They go to college more, they get advanced degrees more, right? They go to private schools, these types of things. But what Lukács says is when you compare the knowledge that's actually acquired by the working class, the proletariat, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, he's going to say that it's actually the working class that has more knowledge. Why? Well, he says the working class benefits from this dual vision and has a better understanding of how the world actually works. But again, why? Well, says what happens is if we look at your own culture, your own social class, everyone's social class has their own, I guess a paradigm would be a way to say it, right? Uh, Practices, traditions, sort of morality, terminology, all of these things, like a way of doing things for your social structure, right? And both the working class and the ruling class both have these, right? But since the working class is controlled by the ruling class, the working class needs to be familiar with both its own world and the world of the ruling class, the world of those who are the dominant force. But it doesn't work the other way. The ruling class doesn't need to care what the working class does. So long as the workers continue to produce, the working class is the world of the working class is not knowledge that the ruling class needs, right? So yeah, think of it like this. Titanic, right? We've all seen the film. There was room on the raft or the piece of wood, whatever. There's a great example in this one scene or scenes in Titanic that shows this idea of dual vision or second sight. So we all remember the scene where Jack comes up from below deck, puts on his nice tuxedo, and goes to dinner with the upper class with Rose, right? So Jack is clearly part of this not upper class, right? He has his own traditions, his own methods of talking to one another. There's differences in conceptions of right and wrong, morality, different social practices, and he has to know those of the ruling class to go do this, and he succeeds for the most part, right? He knows how to hold his arm here to carry a lady. He knows what fork to use at dinner. He knows how to make polite discussions. He knows how to dress, these types of things, right? So he needs to know not only his own world, which is the world of the lower classes, but this upper world, this world of Rose's class, right? And it's vitally important that he does. If he fails at this, he'll probably be arrested, right? This comes through in a lot of this idea of dual sight is that to understand the ruling class is vitally important to one's survival, right? If we look at issues regarding, racist Southern cultures, is of importance of survival for African Americans in the South to recognize that culture and understand it. Right? So here, Jack has to, in sort of much more low stakes, but Jack has to have that knowledge of the upper class as well as his own class. But what happens later in the night? They go below deck, right? Rose is taken into Jack's world now. And what happens? She knows nothing of it. She doesn't know the songs. She doesn't know the dances. She doesn't know how to behave here, right? She's sort of looking for cues from Jack. If Jack acted that way at dinner, it would have been a disaster. But here it's cute. Here it's just her ignorance being played off, right? Because there's no need for her as someone of the ruling class to know the world of the working class. There's nothing at stake there. She can be ignorant of this world. So what Lukács says is that those from the working class have second sight or dual vision. They see their own world on the right here. But they also have to know the world of those who are the dominant class of the ruling class on the left. The same is not true of those of the ruling class. They only need to know the world on the left. They don't need to know the world on the right because it doesn't affect them. So, how does this relate? Well, when we look at gendered sight, we can apply this. If we take it out of the idea of economics and convert it to gender, that dominant and ruling class becomes the masculine view, and that working class becomes the female or the feminine view. standpoints that we discuss have value in that these um, they know and understand the dominant position but stand apart from it as well. So this becomes really important in like third wave and intersectional feminism that we'll talk about second wave feminism next class and then third wave and intersectional feminism next week. Essentially what they're going to claim is that these perspectives matter and they're more varied than what we see. But in short, this idea becomes that these standpoints matter because women can go out and see this is I understand how a male researcher might interpret this. I might interpret it differently. Right? This is certainly what Sandra Blaffer Hardy is going to claim. She claims there's something to a female researcher that would ask questions that a male researcher would not. That would see certain types of primate behavior and ask why, when a male researcher would just take it as natural. Right? So that's where we'll start on. I love this picture, and I just wanted to include it at the end. I didn't have a good way to do it, so I thought it would just be like a waving bye image. Yeah, that's where we'll pick up on Thursday then with this work from second wave feminism from Evelyn Fox Keller regarding how gender stereotypes are harmful to the sciences. A more sort of fully fleshed out argument there. So yeah, so take a look at the final essay handout. Make sure that if you have any questions on that. Also, don't forget the response paper is due by the end of the day today, so 11:59 p.m. tonight. If you have not already uploaded that to Blackboard, please do so. If you have any questions on that, shoot me an email. And yeah, if I don't hear from you, I will post the lecture on Keller on Thursday. All right, everybody stay safe, and I'll talk to you all then.